Good morning, everybody. I'll upload this kind of, right after I make it. I want to just do a few things I'm working on. You might also get the next teaching video after this one, which will be Samuel 15. And I'm trying to kind of connect all these studies together. I just did a little review as well to kind of tie the book of Hebrews, Samuel, and the Gospel of John, and you'll see that one as well. I want you to see it's raining out, so it's nice. I like it when it rains, but I can't walk outside when it rains. I want to just do a little update because that little case I spoke about this past year, which was from Netflix. It was called Making of a Murderer. It was the story of Stephen Avery and all. Those of you that watched that, I kind of talked about that. But the nephew in that case, Brendan Fraser, they just ordered him released. A top court looked at that case, and the only reason they looked at that case, it's the Making of a Murderer case. That was a very popular Netflix series. And the uncle and also the nephew, who was 16 years old at the time, Brendan Fraser, they showed in that documentary, they showed a lot of wrongdoing. So they just ordered either retry that kid or release that kid. And I felt that they did an injustice on him. At the end of my commentary on that series, I felt that Stephen Avery was guilty, if you remember watching it. Though I knew that there was a lot of lying that was done. And one thing I knew from my experience that I worked with police and sheriffs for 25 years. And one thing I knew they lied at openly, but they hope the public don't see. At one point in that case, whenever a DPS or sheriff or cop pulls over a vehicle, you do what's called running the tags. You call in the license plate, and you do a check to see if a person has warrants out or whatever. And in that case, in the court trial of Stephen Avery, they had on audio the cop calling in Stephen Avery's license plate, or the license plate of the woman who was murdered. And he's calling it in to his dispatcher, saying, run the plates, and she gives him, and is this the year? He's at the vehicle, the officer, identifying the car, which was the car of the woman that was murdered, tragically. But in court, part of their case, the cops in that case, were that they never found that vehicle on that day where they ran the license plates. And they had that cop on the stand, and they played the audio of him running the plates. He was by that car, and they had it on the dispatcher audio, and he denied it. He said, no, I don't know. I just was, just picking a number out of my head. I knew they lied. And there was other things in that case where officers were told by the judge, that particular police department were told, you are not allowed to be investigating this scene anymore because it's proven that you're criminals. Yeah. Well, one of those cops went back to the scene months later. The one cop that was told, we know that you are a criminal. You're going to plant evidence. Sure enough, he went back to the scene and found the key piece of evidence that was right on the floor. I forgot what it was. The keys. Michael Morton. Michael Morton was a man. I'll talk a little bit about it. I want you to understand, in Scripture, there's something that we refer to as the spirit of Jezebel. And a lot of people teach, charismatics teach what exactly does that mean. But there's a spirit of deception. And it plays out either in false accusation, in many women going through divorce. This has happened a lot. Accuse the ex of molesting the children. Later on, the children admit it was all a lie. Everybody eventually knows it's a lie. when the child comes out, but yet the husband stays in prison because because they all lied. Even prosecutors in many of those cases, they all were in deception. And there's an average belief in the public when you see an officer. There are many good officers, but there are many that are criminals. There's an average public perception in grand jury proceedings and all that surely these judges or prosecutors are outstanding people. Some are, but some are the most criminal minds that you would ever see. And in the Michael Morton case, this was a good man who worked, I believe it was Texas, I covered it before, but his wife was murdered. And his wife was murdered while he was at work. I think he worked at Walmart. Well, they had a lot of evidence in the case that they could have found the real murderer, because later on they found out there was a serial murderer who was in that neighborhood and who the son of Michael Morton identified that man being in the house that night. So there was a serial murderer who lived in Michael Morton's neighborhood. He had a particular description, and the son said that he gave a description of a man who happened to have been that serial murderer. Now, what the prosecutor did in that case is the prosecutor hid evidence, and he charged Michael Morton with the murder of his wife. And he cooked up a scheme. Now, this is the spirit of Jezebel, because in that man was the same type of a thing that you would see with a prostitute. It's a dynamic. In some cases of officer abuse, officers have sodomized victims, because in society, in prison, I have a lot of friends that have done prison time, and they basically told me, John, when you're in prison, you're not considered gay if you have a, quote, girlfriend. If you have another guy that is your woman, but you're playing the male role, and you're the male in that relationship, and the other guy plays the female role, my friends have told me, you're not considered yourself gay, because not everybody does that, but some do. And of course some people are gay as well in prison. But I noticed that when you dominate another man, even in the area of sexual assault, this is a dynamic that's in society. So, in the Michael Morton case, this prosecutor made up a false story. I forget the prosecutor's name, but this man will be in hell. This man will go to hell for sure. Because what he did was he lied, and he lied in a scale of where the whole system of grand jury and everything were used for his own personal means. So he had a story that Michael Morton's wife did not want to have sex with him on his birthday, so he murdered his wife. Now, Michael Morton didn't do any of that. There was a serial killer that tragically murdered Michael Morton's wife. But this prosecutor, day after day, it was the lips of false accusation that flowed from this man. He did it. He did it in a sexual way, which was all false. Michael Morton and his wife had a young boy at that time. And the young boy was very young. And he also, when they interviewed that boy, gave a description, like I said, of the actual murderer, but they covered that on purpose. And during the crime scene, they found a handkerchief, a piece of clothing in the backwoods behind the house that had blood on it. Okay? Now, when Michael Morton was convicted, of the brutal murder of his wife because she did not want to have sex with him. There were news stories all over about it in the papers. Every one of those lies that went out through the paper, through the grand jury process, through the process, all of them came out of the heart of that wicked prosecutor. The furthest thing from justice, righteousness, public service, equal to the most heinous criminal that you'll ever find, was in that man's heart. And it resides in the hearts of many of these men that play that role, because in Scripture there is no judicial role for a prosecutor. In Scripture there is one definition of him who makes accusation, and that's called Satan. In Scripture you have a biblical concept of the judicial system that comes out of Scripture. Okay, this is called natural law. And in Scripture, if there's an accusation, the person comes before, sort of like a judge. There are witnesses, but there's no role of a person who makes accusation except the victim. The victim could say, no, he did this, and then the community, this is where it comes out of the Old Testament. But the development of our system has this, prosecutors who feel that their role, and I'm not saying they're all bad men, but they feel that their role is they're serving God. Some are Christians, and they feel, well, that's our role, John. We make the accusation, but that's very unbiblical, and it's going to bring a tremendous judgment on those men because they don't understand that. Even good Christian men who are in the role of prosecutors, if they know, well, here's a case, and here's so much evidence we have, and then you make that accusation, and if that accusation is wrong, even if the person like Michael Morton is finally released 30 years later, you still released something that is very unbiblical, because you released untruth, lies. So in the Morton case, he was innocent. And there's a documentary on it. I would recommend you watch it. But after all the years trying to get him out, finally the Innocence Project took his case, and they had that piece of evidence, which was the key piece of evidence. And they said, let's just do a DNA test on this piece of clothing that we found behind the house where Michael Morton's wife was murdered. Let's just test it. And the prosecutor, the DA in that case, fought the testing of that piece of clothing for 7 years. So Michael Morton did another 7 as they were waiting for this to be tested. Finally, the prosecutor, I think, believed in his lie. Finally, after I think Morton did about 30 years in prison, his son grew to hate him. In the documentary, his son had health problems. It's a very sad story. And Michael Morton, while he was in prison, his family, I think sister-in-law, raised the son. Everybody hated that man with a passion. They learned to hate him. But it all was produced out of the wickedness of that DA. Don't ever assume that those are righteous men. Many of them are very wicked. Many of them are very wicked. And so the DA fought the release of that evidence for 7 years. Finally, they tested it. And when they tested the clothing, the piece of material found, it had the blood of Michael Morton's wife on it and the blood of the serial killer who murdered her. Now, when that evidence came out, it's still up to that DA whether or not to release Mr. Morton, whether or not for him to admit after 30 years of destroying that family, because the son came to hate the father. And in the documentary, the son visited the father, and the father tried to, of course, the father was a victim as well, Michael Morton, because his wife was brutally murdered, and then he was put in prison for 30 years, had to learn to live in a cage, all because of the wickedness of a DA, of a man who would be in the same case of people who rape other men in prison, because he dominated. It was every lie came out of that man's mind. It's wicked imaginations. There's tremendous corruption in that. Tremendous wickedness. The heart of man is desperately wicked. Now, when they presented the prosecutor in that case, the DA prosecutor, when they presented the new evidence that a serial killer was in the neighborhood, that week he was identified and we got the blood, and he still did not want to release Michael Morton. He still was going to say, no, Mr. Morton had a fair trial. The people believed my lies. Therefore, it makes no difference whether or not we found the true murderer. Mr. Morton's going to stay in prison. That was his position. Don't ever think these men are righteous. Many of them are the most wicked people you'll ever see on the earth. Do you understand that? This man, at that stage, had his own life, his own career. And in the documentary, they said he saw himself as a rock star, the prosecutor, that he controlled that room. And it was all lies that that man cooked up in his mind. Finally, they released Michael Morton. Now, the serial killer that murdered Michael Morton's wife, who the prosecutor did his best to cover up for that serial killer, to not release evidence, and he went on and murdered other people throughout the years. Finally, I think he was, I forget what happened, either this man died or they got him. But what I wanted you to see, now here in our area, we had many cases this last few years, and I realized the newspaper realized that, not to that same degree, but a lot of it was happening here, because the newspaper, the Kohler Times, did a bunch of articles on that. And they finally, it's very hard to get a district attorney to actually go before a judge. But because of some local lawyers who kind of saw a lot of this was happening, that there was some criminal acts, they managed to get a particular case, and one I spoke about, Guy Tom, and they managed to get the DA here, Mark Skirka, before a judge, and they showed wrongdoing, that he retaliated against one of his prosecutors, Rita Cable, or Cable. She just quit and went to work in Clayborough County, and the DA hired someone else. But they showed lies. They showed how they had witnesses, a man by the name of Valent, that they coaxed him to lie about a key witness in a murder case. They showed a lot of wrongdoing. There was a woman by the name of Hannah Overton, a famous case, made it to all these famous shows, 60 Minutes and all. Hannah Overton had a stepson, and she goes to a church right over here, right off of Rodfield Road in Corpus Christi. She was a Christian missionary. She was raising a foster child by the name of Andrew Bird. They were wanting to adopt that child. Well, she took that child to the doctor at the emergency room, and that child died. And she said that the child had, she didn't know what happened, but that he had an eating disorder, and he was eating a lot of food, and sometimes she would give him Cajun seasoning and water, and that was what Hannah said. Well, the prosecutor, the DA here, Mr. Skirka, he charged Hannah with like a capital murder case, which was a higher charge than if, I see a lot of cases where gangs and all go out and actually murder. There was a case here, a man was killed here, he was 40-something, and the kids went out and beat him with a bat. See, some of the people I work with, it's a year ago. And the kid just got like, I don't know, 15 years for the murder. You have actual murders where people are going out and saying, my intent is I'm going to go murder this other guy because he didn't pay a drug. And they get maybe 15 years, and they do not all of that time. They're out in 8 years. But what they charged Hannah with was the most severe thing, capital murder, life in prison without parole. Because the DA said he felt that Hannah Overton poisoned, Mark Skirka said his case was Hannah Overton poisoned Andrew Bird by forcing him to drink water with Cajun seasoning in it. And some of the proof, he said, was the high sodium levels in the boy's body. Okay. Now, they made a plea deal with Hannah Overton. And we've also found out that the way Mark Skirka worked here was he would overcharge and then pretend he has evidence. This came out. A judge rebuked him for it. This is why it's amazing this man is still here. And the judge said, "You are lying to us." The judge said this to Mark Skirka: "You lie to us because you're pretending you have evidence and you're trying to force these people to plea. And you're overcharging them with capital murder in cases where you might have something that might actually wind up being innocent. And you're pretending you're ready to go to trial." And on the day of trial, Skirka was saying, "Nah, never mind, we dropped the whole case." And the judge, a local judge, rebuked him. So now you have criminal activity that was going on for a while. And in the Hannah Overton case, they offered her, they said, "We're going to charge you with capital murder, life in prison without..." She says, "For what? My son had an eating disorder and was drinking things, and I did not kill my son." She was trying to adopt him. They said, "No, you either plead, woman. If you don't plead, we're going to send you up for the rest of your life." Made a very big case about it. Well, she went to trial. And in the trial, they also violated the actual regulation on how, because they found Hannah Overton guilty of negligence. This case caught my attention because it was like a case where you'd be guilty of the standard of care. Hannah was also a nurse, I believe. So they found her that, not that she intentionally did anything, but that she just didn't take him. They found her guilty that she didn't take him to the doctor in time. That's a very low step compared to a gang kid who says, "I'm going to go murder somebody," and he actually kills him. Hannah was convicted of simply not taking Andrew Bird in the right amount of time to the doctor. Now, I felt this case was real dangerous because you might have a mother with a child who gets injured. She might actually take that child in, and if the child dies, and it had nothing to do with the mother, they could rule, "Well, you didn't take him in time, and you're going to prison for life." That's the standard that they now set in Oasis County with this case. Well, they found Hannah guilty not of poisoning her son. They didn't find her guilty of that. They found her guilty of simply not taking him in time. But Mark Skirka brought all that other stuff in. So they convicted her on that negligence, and they gave her the same penalty for capital murder, which was life without parole. I believe that's what they gave her, which you're not supposed to do, because the jury instruction, you could never give somebody a penalty of capital murder when you just found them of negligence. But what came out in that case, this is one of many. That's why I'm telling you, these guys don't assume. What came out in that case was they argued in court, Mark Skirka argued in court, that they had a doctor who also testified, that yes, it was poisoning and all that. But they lied about that because that doctor came out and risked his life. In this area, you risk your life. He risked his life by having to come out on his own in the public and say, "No, the prosecutor's lying about my testimony." In this case, the other assistant prosecutor, Rita Cable, I think, or one of the others, Sandra Eastwood, they also came out and admitted, "We're sorry, we lied. We lied, we did deception, we did all." Still, her case, Hannah Overton, she did about 7 years in prison. It made it all the way to the governor, the Supreme Court. Finally, they sent it back. Finally, she got released, and Mark Skirka swore, "I'm going to retry her." This man is corrupt. I believe his intent is criminal. Now, when you have people like that, because he kept pursuing, finally he had to drop the case. But you say, "John, what about when all the other people came out and admitted that they committed criminal acts?" The parts of the witnesses and no accountability. This man is still doing the same tactics today. And then he appears sometimes on TV and says, "We're out to catch crooks." I believe that they would collude to have officers that are corrupt to murder witnesses. I believe they would do that in this county. Okay? I believe they would do that. Now, I do understand that Mayor Nelda and all these people that are also responsible for things that were reported to them. When you cover all that up, the average public thinks the man in the Michael Morton case, the wicked prosecutor, who will be in hell soon unless he's already in hell. I don't know if he died. What you have is absolute criminality, a mind of wickedness that can concoct and poison the mind of Michael Morton's son, Michael Morton's son, he would have no contact with his father. He visited his father in prison. And then finally, when the son turned 18, he said, "Dad, I'm not coming to see you no more." And his son read all the paper articles of how his father brutally murdered his wife because he wanted sex, and he was a sex fiend, and his wife. And his son read that. It's shown the everything his son read came out of the corrupt mind of one single district attorney prosecutor. It all came out of there. It was all lies that came out that went in public, went in papers, went in court. But it was all produced from the mind of a very wicked man who had no accountability. And it took them years to finally get that prosecutor DA, what is his name? I forget. He did like 2 days in jail. Besides the fact that he was responsible, the guilt of all the other people that serial killer killed, because he kept covering up for the serial. Some of them, and that role is not biblical. This is what I want Christians. That role is not biblical, to stand and make accusation. What you do is you look at it. In many cases, even of people that are not convicted, still, when that prosecutor releases the accusation, knowing it's false, say, well, we think we have a case, we know a witness lied, but we're going to release this accusation. You incur a judgment upon yourself when you do that, when you don't speak truth. So I wanted you to understand the Hannah Overton case. They did a whole documentary. I want to maybe get that documentary to see if I can show it on our little video thing. Maybe I can find it and we'll post it, because it won like a independent film festival thing. Hannah Overton was interviewed, but there was all of the exposing of the lies that they did. Besides all the other cases, no, they're still doing that. They're still doing that. The famous case of Carlos Deluna, the one death penalty case, officers in Corpus Christi lied about that. Carlos Deluna was convicted and put to death for the murder of a girl at a store on North Beach, where you see me sometimes make videos. Carlos Deluna said his other friend, Carlos Hernandez, did it. Carlos Hernandez might have done it. That's what the book was written on it. But the cops in that case, when Carlos Deluna said no, it was Carlos Hernandez, the local Corpus Christi Police Department, said there is no such person as Carlos Hernandez. That's a phantom of your imagination. Later on, we found out that Carlos Hernandez actually worked as an informant for the CCPD, so they lied. Now, if those detectives that lied there are still alive, the judgment of God is going to come upon them. They hope that over periods of time, their criminal acts and you could see that. So I've not changed my position. I believe the murder of Tom Greenwell. Tom Greenwell was murdered here in Oasis County Court, in his chambers. Now, they determined that Tom Greenwell shot himself in the head, but there were questions whether or not there was a hit on Mr. Greenwell. That people questioned this. And that story made it to the national news in a way that said it looks suspicious, because the local sheriff and all, they never came out and gave a final, real, public, open records, public thing. What happened? They just said, they said, we're going to show some results later. I spoke to a woman who was shot by the Corpus Christi Police Department. I shared her case. She was a Christian woman running the Catholic stand at the World Trade Center. I accidentally ran into her. You're going to see it I didn't interview her. She was afraid to be interviewed. But she was a Christian woman that I was at the flea market. It's called Trade Center here. And I was just looking around, and I'll go to the Christian or religious stands, because I'll look at all this stuff. And she was running a Catholic stand. So I was there maybe for an hour, and then as I was talking to her, I found out she lived where I live, which is called Flower Bluff. And so I said I work with a lot of street people. I got mad at the end because she saw it. She didn't want to tell me. I must have spoke for 3 hours to her, and I said, I do a lot of Catholic teaching, and I said, as well as just in general Christian teaching, I'm not anti-Catholic. I let her know that. So then, right at the end of talking to her for a few hours, my daughter was there that day too. She said, Dad just stayed at that stand. she showed me a bullet wound. She showed me one or two on her finger. I don't know if the finger's missing. And because she heard me talking about work. So I thought, oh, maybe she has a past, like gang thing. I said, how'd you get that? And she didn't want to tell me. She said, the Corpus Christi police shot me. I think she was shot. They shot her vehicle, I don't know, 17 times, 16 times. She was hit 6 times or 3 times, something of that nature. Oh, I got mad. I said, what happened? And now she gave her story to me. And I asked her if she wanted to do it on video. And she said she was been harassed, that they would go after her. Boy, I don't know if I cursed or not. But it was a story here in Flower Bluff where, and what she had told me was, she got in an argument with her husband. And she had a gun, took it in her vehicle and went out to the island, to the ocean here. And so the call might have came in to the police department as a woman, domestic violence, and maybe threatening to commit suicide. That's kind of what I picked up as she's telling me. She said she went out there. The cops were at the house where the husband called. I think neighbors were involved. And she said she came back to her house when the police officers were there, Corpus Christi police. And she said she was on the phone, called the police department, but she was on the phone with the female dispatcher. And the female dispatcher was talking to her on the phone. The police were there at her house where this happened here in Flower Bluff. And she said they knew she had a weapon, which is dangerous. And what she told me was they told her, the dispatcher said, no, go ahead and put your gun up on the dashboard. And she said to me, the woman, she said she told the lady on the phone, the cop lady, dispatcher, she said, but I have to pick it up. It's on the floorboard and I don't want any, She said, no, that's fine. Now, obviously, the police that were at the scene did not know she was talking to the police on the phone, okay? Look, dispatchers mess things up, okay? I know this. So she said when she picked up the gun, they shot her. And she said the vehicle was hit. So this was Corpus Christi, Texas. And then she showed me she almost died. She had one. She didn't show me her chest wound, but she showed me the few bullet marks that she had. Now, if that was there was that they still charged her with whatever it was they were going to charge her with. She said that they needed her husband to make an official charge against her because he didn't want to do it. She told me that they told the husband, we need you to make an official charge because now that she was shot. And he didn't want to charge her. And they held her, she said she was in solitary confinement for 6 months or something until they finally had to get her to admit to something because it would have looked bad that they shot that woman. She said her husband told her he had to do the charge because the cops had said to him, if you don't do the charge, we're going to take your kids from you. CPS and all. This is her story to me. But I know she was shot, and I don't think she lied about that, okay? Because she didn't know I dealt with any of this. That's why I got very upset at the end. Now, none of the names, by the way, were Tommy Nichols. Because I said, what were the names of those officers? I think she said Skinner or something. But she mentioned all 5 of them, but the one that hit her with the bullets, she remembered his name. None of them, though, were, sometimes I talk about other things, but none of them were Tommy Nichols. But it was a Flower Bluff thing. And today I just want you to see, I'm going long here, I want you to see all of these things and the cases that make it public national. And also all that was, because what happened in our local area was the Corpus caller, they were the ones that our newspaper put a lot of pressure. I think they finally felt bad because Mr. Skirka, he's lost. He's not going to be the DA, thankfully, anymore. And he lost a primary bid to another Democratic opponent who was a defense lawyer with tattooed on his chest, not guilty and all. And for him to have, so I think the Calder Times felt bad. Look, I wouldn't feel bad. Because Mr. Skirka, even when he was in court in Judge Nanette Hassett's court, she's married to Terry Shamsey. And he's a defense attorney. And even in the court, it was evident that he also broke the law by retaliating against Rita Kable, who left, who quit and went to Clay. Look, there was criminality. You had medical guys saying no, that you had enough that there should be criminal charges. Not only are they not criminal charges, they're still doing this. As far as I know, they're still doing all this. So never forget. I don't know. You'll see some of these. I believe that they put hits out on people. I do believe this. That an element of those that are in criminal acts in this area, I believe they kill people because they never fully did an investigation on a judge who was murdered in his chambers. And if it was suicide, then that should be released. The sheriff, Kalin, said they were going to do an investigation. They never released the final thing. Another man who's quite intelligent, I read his blog, Patriot Dad, he believes they were connected with some underground criminal activity. And I've heard enough, but the fact, you said that's hearsay. No, we've had, that's what I'm saying. You've actually had in Nueces County, before judges exposed that they committed criminal acts. And even the medical examiner in the Hannah Overton case said, no, they're lying about my testimony. Prosecutors in that case who prosecuted her came out and felt guilty and said, no, we broke the law while we did Hannah Overton. You would think the DA would face charges. The public's not aware that the men who rule the law, if they break that law, and thus in the sight of God, that one Michael Morton case, you must understand that all of that wickedness of false accusation, the destruction of that man's family, his son finally didn't even want to reunite, all of that was produced out of a mind and a heart that was full of lies, deceit, and criminal activity. And that man it also is culpable of the murders that the serial killer, all of that, and this is just one. Mike Nifong, Duke Lacrosse, there's a public image that somehow these men are involved in righteousness. Now, some of them might be. But just remember, even you Christian prosecutors, I understand some of you are good enough. I want you to understand that the role is unbiblical to make accusation, okay? The law is good and just. And when Paul describes that in the book of Romans, he's speaking about the biblical role of law in society. But to make accusation, that in the scriptural model, which is the one Paul's saying is good and just, you don't have that role of adversary, another person besides the victim who makes accusation. But in our system we have that. And you encourage judgment. I fully believe that the prosecutor, Michael Morton, because as far as I know, he continued to cover up, never really admitted his wrongdoing. He will be in hell or is in hell. Because judgment, wrath of God, separation from God, and all of that had nothing to do with justice. And that's one case out of many. The ones upset me, there's been a case of black guy on death row, and later they found out, oh, he's innocent, and they still wanted to go through with they would prefer to have put that black man to death after many years on death row, because there was another case where the prosecutor thought, oh, if it's exposed that I did wrongdoing, my career's done, and he would have preferred for that black man to have been put to death because they had a pressure. That's so wicked. That's so wicked. Okay? This is an update. I want you to see. I want you to understand. Look at those cases. Look at those things. They just hope that time goes by, and then they'll go back and assault, murder, kill, whatever they just hope that time goes by. That's why those that are not familiar with any of this don't realize that the accountability is not. I believe we need the federal Department of Justice to really come into Nueces County. I believe it was voted number 2 most corrupt in the U.S. I believe you have real, and you say, John, no, these are not just accusations. I told you those things that I mentioned came out in court. Okay, medical director saying we lied, prosecutors saying we lied on purpose, we deceived. All of that came out in court. Witnesses standing up in court and saying the DA wanted me to lie against this violent case. The cops made violent. They said we need all of that has been. So in a normal county, there would be some type of correcting of that. In this county, none, zero. All those cops that got the violent to lie, broke the law, they're still doing that as far as I know. There was zero accountability. So don't give some image. Don't give some image. You say we want a better public image. Then you correct that. You correct that. The name of those officers that got felon to lie. Who were they? That sat down, that came out in court. Are they still running rogue? You got officers that I've given you names that beat the shit out of people in this city. Targeted them. With the full acknowledgement of the mayor and the commissioners and everybody in this town. And you let those guys run loose, rampant, threatening to run people off the road, making death threats that I reported about a friend of mine. Don't ever give the impression to the community that you got a wonderful city until you deal with those issues that came out. Hannah Overton lives in fear because that corrupt DA said, we're going to retry you. That woman that was shot, that Catholic woman at the stand, I said, do you want to speak? She said, no, because they went after me for years, and I don't want them to come after me anymore. You say, we're public servants. Get some accountability. Because of what the Kohler Times did on the Broken Doors expose, on the fact that the police department here, if you were a woman of domestic abuse and you were calling in on a Friday night and saying, my ex-husband is going to murder me, the local police department were closed for that particular thing on the weekends. The domestic violence unit, if you called them Friday, you had to wait till Monday. And they were not going to change that. Chief Markle was not going to change that. And they had to get pressured. And they finally said they're going to do some open hours on the weekends. So, say we don't you now. You have citizens in this city living in self-defense mode because they've been threatened. You pretend that you have justice and law. There's enough that DA should be in prison for all of the cases of subordinate false testimony. And he colludes with other criminal people that work for the department to go and get witnesses. And you let that go on. You let that go on. All right. God bless everybody.